Turning the Page. I'm host Donnie Morse of Confetti Antiques and Books. And today we're pleased to have with us a couple of special guests. First we have Tom Kimball, who is the marketing director for Signature Books in Salt Lake. And Signature Book has recently published a new book, the Nauvoo City and High Council Minute book by John S. Dinger. And John is here with us today to speak about his book and tell us a little bit more about the history behind the book and why he decided to write or edit this book, rather. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Don.
We also have with us a couple of exciting guests here. We have James Rhyme Chisel and his son-in-law. I don't know your name.
Joel Gardner.
Say again?
Joel Gardner.
Joel Gardner. Well, welcome here to the program as well. John, get us started in your book. Tell us a little bit about some of the exciting things that we can find in this book.
All right, thank you very much. I'm appreciative to be here. And let me just jump in. I'm going to assume that most people that like this book have a basic knowledge of Mormon history. I mean, at least know the basics. This is a book where you really get into the nitty and gritty of Nauvoo and really get to see a city develop both well, religiously and civilly.
So, city, the Nauvoo City, that's the city council?
It is. Yeah, so we have the minutes from these two governing bodies, the City Council and the High Council.
Oh.
And one obviously took care of the day-to-day civil type activities, and the other took care of the religious aspect of the city. And so how we get started is the High Council started in Kirtland in 1834. And what they did is they set up a main High Council that was to be the governing High Council for the church. And then as other branches would open up, they would have their own High Councils, but the main governing High Council was the one in the center of Zion, which at the time was Kirtland. Well, when the Saints left Missouri and went to Quincy, later Nauvoo, in 1839, they formed a presiding High Council at that point. And that was started in October 20th of 1839, and that's where the record starts here in this book, and it continues.
So they were really good at keeping minutes?
They were. They would try to meet at least once a week, and sometimes they missed, other times they didn't, but they were very good record keepers and spoke and took notes of just about everything that was going on.
So this High Council, this wasn't the quorum of the 12?
It wasn't, and in fact that's one of the really interesting aspects of the book is where these councils all fit in with each other. During that time, as the High Council developed, it certainly became, you could see that it was over certain other groups. Clearly, it was the governing body over the 70, the Elders' Quorum, other High Councils, but there's this question really of who was higher up, the 12 Apostles or the High Council, and that actually comes to a head sort of near the end time in Nauvoo after Joseph Smith dies, and they're deciding who takes over the church. So
this conflict, is it detailed in the minutes?
It is, and I don't know that I necessarily want to call it a conflict as much as everybody's figuring out who stands where and just who has to answer to whom. For example, one section in here that I quite like, and let me go to my notes. It was actually the 1841 General Conference. So in April 6th of 1841 is pretty important. Kind of this plays out who is in charge of whom. And let me read this. Well, let me set it up a little bit. They had a conference, and just like today, you have to sustain the leaders of the church. And certain members of the church, certain individuals holding high callings were objected to. So once these objections were noted,
by just the general population of the church?
By the general population of the church, it then moved to the High Council to actually talk about this and decide what they're going to do. And so let me read from the book from April 6, 1841. The council next proceeded to approve or disapprove of certain men for offices who had been objected to as unfit for the offices hereafter named by the quorum of the General Conference. Elder John A. Hicks, president of the Elders Quorum of Nauvoo, was first taken up for consideration. Objections were made to him relative to a trial which had been between him and Elder John P. Green, which trial was had before the High Council of Nauvoo, May 2, 1840. Some were dissatisfied with him, thinking that he had not abided the decision of that council. But however, after the matter had been explained and the subject discussed at some length, he was approved by the majority. Bishop Alanson Ripley was next taken into consideration. Objections were made to him for his drinking and immoral habits, which necessarily follows, and his abusing his brethren while under the influence of liquor. His situation and character was discussed at considerable length, after which he was approved by the majority. John E. Page, one of the 12, was next taken into consideration. Objections were made to him for having written certain abusive letters, incriminating certain individuals wrongfully. After this case had been spoken on at considerable length, he was unanimously approved. Noah Packard, Sr., one of the counselors for the president of the High Priest Quorum, was next taken into consideration. Objections were made to him for his rash and ignorant expressions, which was, however, soon reconciled. He was approved. James Foster, one of the presidents of the Quorum of the 70s, was next taken into consideration. Objections were made to him for his lack of faith and stability in the gospel and dishonesty in his temporal dealings with his brethren. He was unanimously disapproved. Newell K. Whitney, bishop, was next taken into consideration. He was unanimously approved. Adjourned. Hosea Stout, clerk. And so what this shows me is that at least in 1841, the High Council was considered higher than the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, because as you heard, when one of the Quorum of the 12 was objected to, who did it go to? It went to the High Council. And as you also see, they had jurisdiction over the 12, the 70s, bishops, elders, high priests, and they were even able to object to one of those. He was not, who was that? That was Mr. James Foster, president of the 70s. So here, the Quorum, or the High Council, could have removed a member of the Quorum of the 12 in 1841.
Was the prophet Joseph Smith the mayor as well? Who presided over the Council of the 12 versus the...
Oh, good question. The High Council was presided by the stake president, similar to how it's set up today, and that was William Marks. And I think he is actually a very ignored person in the church today. He's kind of associated and lumped into what I call the three Williams: William Law, William Smith, and William Marks, and they're all kind of considered, you know, these apostates who didn't come west, and I think that is really untrue with William Marks. Besides being the stake president, he was actually on the city council, so he's in the city council minutes as well. He helped pass ordinances and that. He was a member of the Council of 50. He was one of the Quorum of the Anointed. He was actually one of the first people to receive his endowments, and he was just a great, wonderful leader there in Nauvoo, and somebody I really like. Where his falling occurred, and where I think he's unfairly called an apostate, and you get this throughout the book, his story is so interesting, is on April 12th, 1843, and I hope I'm right with that, that's when the polygamy revelation was read to the High Council. And three members of the High Council just couldn't stomach it: Austin Cowles, Leonard Sobey, and William Marks. And as you look in the history and where these three people went, Austin Cowles, he stuck it out for a couple months and then ultimately resigned. And then he later was hooked up in the Nauvoo Expositor affair, kind of went that route. So I think the label of apostate is fair for him. Leonard Sobey stuck it out, but in my opinion, and I need to do a little more research on this, I think was kind of a troublemaker. Also in the city council, in early January of 1844, William Law comes and says, somebody's trying to assassinate me. I heard Joseph Smith wants me killed. And then William Marks kind of gets brought into it. They also want to kill William Marks. And as the city council is calling in people, it comes out the rumor originated with Leonard Sobey. And so something I need to look into a little bit more, but Leonard Sobey kind of comes across to me as a troublemaker. And then he and William Marks, here's where the trouble comes in, they actually put in for Sidney Rigdon. they both thought Sidney Rigdon was the true successor after Joseph Smith died. But they both went about it different ways. Leonard Sobey went and was actually ordained by Sidney Rigdon. He was ordaining prophet, priests, and kings in his new church. Leonard Sobey went that route. William Marks didn't. He was up front. He told people, I think Rigdon is the successor. He wasn't ordained. He was up front with everybody the whole time. And that's why I kind of like him. He had this problem. He couldn't accept polygamy, but he was up front about it. He wasn't a troublemaker. And he went with Rigdon, and Rigdon obviously is not our second president of the church. He lost out. But then also in the High Council minutes, Rigdon is put on trial. And it's,
What time period is that then?
This is in 1844, September 10th, I believe.
It's either the 8th or the 10th, I've forgotten.
I believe it's the 10th. Could be the 8th, but they're in September. And it's I mean, you have to put this in context, and again, why I think I appreciate William Marks, and while he may have gone against the grain, he really stuck up.
10th.
The 10th? Okay. He really stood up for what he believed in. What happened is they put him on trial. It was public. And then you had the Quorum of the 12 Apostles say every bad thing they could think of Sidney Rigdon. I mean, everything. They brought up the salt sermon in Missouri, that Emma didn't like him. I mean, just all these things over and over. And when it got to William Marks, he tried to calm it down. He tried to slow it down. And he said, look, I've known Sidney my whole life. He's not a perfect man. He did point out things, Emma didn't like him, but I really want to keep it to the facts. And the facts, he tried to bring it to the facts, not make it an emotional appeal, not make it pointing fingers, anything like that. And ultimately, he did conclude, I thought it was Sidney Rigdon. I'm willing to go with the majority of the church. And he always said that. And, but he cast his lot with Sidney Rigdon at that point, and that kind of stuck with him. At the next general conference, he wasn't sustained. He was removed as the president. And that's where we kind of go. But even after that, when he was removed, he was still faithful, still a member of the church, as far as I see. They called him in because he was such a popular individual, especially outside of Nauvoo. The 12 asked him, kind of told him, look, you need to sign this paper that says Sidney Rigdon isn't the choice. And he said okay, and he was willing to sign that, and even added by himself on his own accord, and the 12 are. And but then he stayed in Illinois and eventually got in with the RLDS Church. But
So that's an important moment in time, though, because that's when the 12 finally presents themselves as being the authority and being the leading council in the church over the High Council, is during that Sidney Rigdon trial.
yeah, and so I mean, I like him.
So he never did come back to
He never did.
the church.
No, but I liked him. I mean, even though.
So you get a flavor of his personality through the minutes, through the book,
You do.
right? I mean, you get to see a lot of who he is, since he was the governing member or highest member of the High Council there in Nauvoo, right?
Absolutely. And this may be wrong, and I may be attributing it wrong, but I thought I heard somewhere that Martin Harris at one point said, I didn't leave the church left me. And that just seems really true about William Marks.
So can I ask a couple questions? All right. What takes precedence here in the minutes? Is it the High Council, the City Council? What goes longer? What starts when?
Okay, the High Council goes longer because the High Council actually was both roles for a few years. And that starts in 1839. And so in 1839 and 1840, you get the flavor of them doing both jobs. They're kind of passing these laws There's certainly laws, but you can see the kind of mix there. It's, I think if somebody is letting their animals run wild and eat everybody's thing, we should excommunicate them. So it's kind of this mix of both. So the High Council is actually the one who gets the city council going. It's by the blessing of the High Council that we can set up a city council. And so then the city council is set up beginning in very beginning of 1841, after the Nauvoo Charter is set. And they elect Joseph Smith, all the names are there. John C. Bennett, infamous John C. Bennett, is actually the mayor for a time until he is excommunicated. And that's all contained in there as well.
Huh.
And that's very interesting. That's a really interesting intersection of both playing together. If you kind of read the documents together, you get that. I can maybe refer to my notes here again. Starting in 1842, this is just an amazing, tumultuous time there in Nauvoo, and a lot of it brought along by John Cook Bennett. And so in February 17th, in front of the city council, they pass a law on marriage. And it's a typical marriage law. Males have to be 17, females have to be 14. You need to, anyone can do it, but you have to go to the clerk and get it, fine. And so starting in February, that comes up. But then in April, we get the first of what the High Council had to deal with a lot in 1842 and actually on 43 and 44. A third of their cases dealt with this, I guess what I'll call this spiritual wifery or adultery or this kind of sexual misconduct. And a lot of it starts back to this time I'm talking about. But the first one in April 27th in front of the High Council is this case of Jesse Turpin, and he is accused of what was called adultery, but basically marrying another man's wife. And you read that in here, the minutes of that hearing, and ultimately he's cleared of that. But that's kind of the start of it. Now, on May 14th, in front of the city council, they pass this ordinance. It's called an ordinance against brothels and disorderly characters. And here is the quote, which I think goes to the disorderly characters. It says, and further, that every act of adultery or fornication which can be proved, the parties shall be imprisoned 6 months and fined each in the sum of from $500 to $50,000. And so that was actually the most significant. I think there were one or two other ordinances where the punishment is actually up to $50,000. But that's just an astronomical amount.
Do you know if anybody was ever punished that way?
There were. I don't know how they came out, but yes, in the municipal court, there are other records of that, not found in here. But the municipal criminal court, yes, there were cases of adultery in there. I don't know what happened with those, though, and certainly I can't imagine a $50,000 fine. So we added, on the 14th, we kind of get this ordinance, and we're thinking, where does this come from? But 3 days later, on May 17th, in front of the city council, John C. Bennett resigns. And 2 days after that, on May 19th, we get from the city council this kind of, it's sort of a, thank you for being here, see you later. Everyone, we're going to part our ways. Nobody's pointing any fingers here. It actually resolved by the city council of the city of Nauvoo that this council tender a vote of thanks to General John C. Bennett for his great zeal in having good and wholesome laws adopted for the government of this city and for the faithful discharge of his duty while mayor of the same. So they go their own ways. But then 2 days later, that kind of blows up. 2 days later, in front of the High Council.
Let's interrupt you right there.
Okay.
Let's go to commercial break. When we get back, we'll talk some more about this blow up, as you say here, that John C. Bennett was involved with here. So this is Turning the Page. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back to Turning the Page. I'm host Donnie Morse, and we're here with Tom Kimball of Signature Books and John Dinger, who is the editor of the Nauvoo City and High Council Minute book. And we've been talking with John about some of the entries that can be found in the Minute book. and more specifically about John C. Bennett. Let's pick up there again if we can.
All right. Like I said, he resigned on May 17th, and then on May 19th, they thank him for his service. Those both in front of the city council, you'll find in the minutes. But then on the 21st of May, so 2 days later, in the high council minutes, brought before the high council is Chauncey Higby. And you may recognize the name Higby. He was involved, 2 years later in the Nauvoo Expositor. So the case here, let me read the charging language. A charge was preferred against Chauncey L. Higby by George Miller for unchaste and unvirtuous conduct with the widow Sarah Miller. 3 witnesses testified that he had seduced several women and at different times had been guilty of unchaste and unvirtuous conduct with them, and taught the doctrine that it was right to have free intercourse with women if it was kept secret, and also taught that Joseph Smith authorized him to practice these things. And so you can imagine how scandalous this is. Here in the High Council, they're accusing Joseph Smith of teaching these things, and basically he's going around doing this and trying to cover with Joseph Smith. Now, we do know by this time Joseph Smith had taken plural wives. However, what the record shows is he did not give Chauncey L. Higby the authority to do that at that time. He was cut off at that point, but then from there it kind of snowballed into this. They started calling in other people, and now you heard that it was Sarah Miller, so then they called in Sarah Miller the next day on May 24th, and they have this sort of deposition. They question her, and here's what she says happened. Some 2 or 3 weeks since, in consequence of Brother Joseph's teaching to the singers, and she was in a choir in Nauvoo, I began to be alarmed concerning myself and certain teachings which I had received from Chauncey L. Higby, and questioned him Higby about his teachings, for I was pretty well persuaded from Joseph's public teachings that Chauncey had been telling falsehoods, but Chauncey said that Joseph now taught as he did through necessity, on account of the prejudices of the people. When he first came round to my house, soon after the special conference this spring, Darwin Chase was with him. Chauncey commented joking with me about my getting married, and he wanted to know how long it had been since my husband died, and soon removed his seat near me, and began his seducing insinuations by saying that it was no harm to have sexual intercourse with women if they would keep it to themselves. I told him I did not believe it, and had heard no such teaching from Joseph, neither personally nor from the stand, but that it was wicked to commit adultery. Chauncey said that did not mean single women, but married women. When he come again, William Smith come with him, and told me that the doctrine which Chauncey Higby had taught me was true. I still had doubts. I told him I understood Higby, had recently been rebaptized, and that Joseph, when he confirmed him, told him to quit all his iniquitous practices. Chauncey said that it was not for such things that he was rebaptized. Chauncey Higby said it would never be known. I told him it might be told in bringing forth a child. Chauncey said there was no danger, and that Dr. Bennett understood it and would come and take it away. And so she started naming names. She named Darwin Chase, she named William Smith, she named John Cook Bennett, and they also had 2 other women testify that same day. They brought out some other names of individuals, all these individuals teaching this spiritual wifery. And it's clear the source of that came from John C. Bennett. And as you read there, he was also accused of willing to perform abortions if pregnancies resulted from this. And so in May, as I said, they started calling these people in, putting them on trial. Interestingly, the one person that didn't get called in was William Smith. That one, who knows how it was taken care of, but not by the High Council. And so after that time, John C. Bennett left. Then he started writing letters in the Sangamo Journal, a newspaper close by, accusing the saints of all sorts of things, including Joseph Smith ordering the death of Governor Boggs from Missouri. This created all sorts of problems, and so in July 20th, the city council, kind of continuing on these 2 groups in concert, they all got together, and what they did was, and I quote, They did testify that John C. Bennett was not under duress at the time he testified before the city council, May 19, 1842, concerning Joseph Smith's innocence, virtue, and pure teaching. His statements that he has lately made concerning this matter are false. There was no excitement at the time, nor was he in any wise threatened, menaced, or intimidated. And they all signed this declaration to kind of say, you know, John C. Bennett's lying. And so the two, I mean, they had their roles. You see this. You had the city council with the civil passing the laws, those types of things. You have the high council taking care of the religious aspects of this. And as I said, this went on and on through 1843 and 1844. Kind of the funny thing, one that I found kind of funny, was Sarah Miller, this woman who was first called out and dimed everybody out. She actually got in trouble a few months later for marrying somebody who was already married. And when called before the high council again, she figured, well, it worked before, let me try it again. Tried to blame it on Chauncey Higby again. And that time they said, we're not buying it. You're cut off.
Huh. That's amazing. I mean, this interaction between the two councils. How big were these councils?
They fluctuated, but the high council had around 12 members,
Okay.
and then the presidency. That one it's a little easier because when they would show up, they would get numbers, and in here, you know, as they have these hearings, they say, okay, and I don't know if it was by lot or random, but it was, okay, number 2 and 4 will speak for the plaintiff, number 7 and 9 will speak for the defendant. They set up these rules where, actually, that's kind of interesting. The first few years, these hearings were a little more loosey-goosey, and then, let me find it here in my notes, but they set up these new rules. Here it is, in 1840. It's actually not too long. In July 11th, they set up these rules that I think are pretty fair to give anybody coming before the High Council a fair shake. And they passed one that both parties have to be present, or at least have had an opportunity to be there. So I guess before they were just excommunicating people and you'd get the notice a month later, I don't know, a week later. They quit doing that. And they would have hearings, though, when people weren't there. One, again, in late 1842, or possibly 1843, there was one where, in fact, it might have been the Sarah Miller, actually. The husband wouldn't show up, the person she married, because he was afraid of being arrested and charged with bigamy. So he actually didn't show up. They still cut him off. The second, they won't hear the complaint beforehand. So they're not going to get prejudiced beforehand. You're not allowed to go in and, hey, listen to what this big jerk did. Okay, let's have the hearing now. And then same with no character evidence without both parties present and somebody can defend. And so they put these new rules in place, and they always had somebody speak for both sides. You were always able to get a defense.
Were the meetings private, or were they open to the public?
I'm not sure all the time. I know that certain meetings were public. Certainly some were actually published and said, hey, we're having a meeting on this subject. Everybody please come.
City or High Council?
The High Council. For example, Sidney Rigdon's was very public. It was published in the Times and Seasons that we're going to hold a trial on him. Please everybody come. And then they published the transcript in the Times and Seasons after. So there were certain high councils that were open. The city council, as I understand, was open. People coming in and out all the time.
Well, there are some fascinating tidbits from Mormon history, or Western history even, that are found in these minutes. Tell us a little bit about the history of the minutes. What happened to them, and why has it taken so long for these things to be published?
Well, the minutes themselves came west. The originals, as I understand, are both housed in the church archives, but they have not been open to researchers. This is actually the first time that they have been published. The city council comes from transcripts made by individuals that were able to see them at some time. The city council the same, though after this was published, the church actually opened up at least a transcript of the city council. So now you can go to the archives and see the city council. The high council, the only place you're going to be able to get it is in this. Now it has been published before. Fred Collier published a little volume, but his wasn't complete. He was missing volume 1 of it, and then he was missing the trial of Sidney Rigdon. It was very exciting, and the trial of George J. Adams as well. George J. Adams, that one is a little interesting because he was the first person to say, not Sidney, not Brigham, Joseph Smith III. He's our man. So,
what was his name again?
George J. Adams.
George J. Adams. Well, let's don't talk about that. Let's use that as a hook here for the public. There are really some fascinating things that you can find here in the Nauvoo City and High Council minutes that you just won't find anywhere else. That it's not published in church history. It's not published anywhere. To understand some of these things, really, the only way to do it is to go back and find the original minutes.
And the important thing, the two important things that are here is the lead up to the Nauvoo Expositor, the narrative and the drama leading up to the Nauvoo Expositor is in these minutes, and also the Sidney Rigdon trial is sort of the aftermath of Joseph's death, and that's here for the first time as well. So I mean, this is really an important publication. It's a game changer in Mormon studies on this topic.
John, anything else you'd like to share with us tonight?
Well, I could talk for hours. I imagine that you don't get that long of a time slot. There are some really interesting things in here. Maybe I'll finish up with, well, are we near the end of our time?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me share with two that I think, these are historical documents, but two that I think have some applicability today that are good counsel even still today. And the first one is the story of Henry Cook and his wife. And they were brought before the High Council as well. And here's the story was, well, he was brought forward on January 17th, 1843. And let me read quote here. Quote, he said, well, let me tell you what he was brought for. He was brought for selling his wife for catfish. Basically, he traded her for her weight in catfish. And he was brought before the High Council. I don't think that's something you see.
Did it say how much she weighed?
It doesn't. It doesn't. But not something you see in High Councils today. But he said, here's what it says. He said that he did not sell her, but something had been said about it, which was understood as a joke by himself and the witness. But the party making the offer held it to a bargain, and so did she. And she didn't really like them. They were having trouble. And so that's what first came out. But then later that same day, they bring in the individual, put the guy on trial who married him. And we get a little bit more. From that it says, it appeared that Mary Cook had left her husband and that her and Wells got married under the plea that he had bought her of Cook for her weight in catfish. And then later on when they finally put on, her and, Henry Cook's, when he puts them on John Wells, one who had bought her, I guess, what I love is the High Council doesn't even name her. Here's what it says. Henry Cook's wife, viz., the catfish woman, and John Wells, who said he had bought her, their case was brought up and opinions formed from the minutes, taken as evidence, and both were expelled by the church and by the council. So they don't even name her by name when they cut her off. She's known as the catfish woman. And I have to imagine she was known as the catfish woman the rest of her life. And so that would be my first piece of advice, is no matter how hard your marriage is going, don't trade your wife for catfish. The second one is from September 6th, 1845. And the week before, Amasa Bonnie was told to come to your trial next week. And so here are the minutes. Amasa Bonnie, who had been cited before the council on the charge of drunkenness, appeared in a high state of intoxication with a bottle in his pocket, and was soon in a state of stupor sleep in the council room, whereupon it was voted unanimously that he be cut off from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and was forthwith conducted from the room by Councilors Wilson and Holman. So the second was, if you're ever called before the High Council, best not show up drunk. And so I think that besides the historical tidbits in here that you can't get anywhere else, it's really a fun read. There are these fun little nuggets, catfish, showing up to hearings drunk, I think that just about anybody would enjoy this book.
Now, the way it's laid out is chronological, right? So as...
Chronological by document. So the first half you're going to get the city council,
Okay.
and then after all that, then you're going to get the high council.
So to follow a story through, is there footnoting or something to help you follow somebody through the minutes, so to speak?
There's an index, a really good index. There are references to, future hearings or feedback, and so you can get the narrative that way, yeah.
Okay. Well, does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask John? John, tell us, as a parting thought, a little bit more about this Nauvoo Expositor and what that really had to do with this time period and what happened in Mormon history right there.
Okay. Now this is a topic that I could speak on for a couple of hours.
Sure.
The Nauvoo Expositor is just such an interesting part, especially for me as an attorney. The Nauvoo Expositor comes out in June of 1844. And as you read these, you see that there's actually trouble starting before. Austin Cowles, as we talked about, he couldn't accept polygamy. The Laws, Wilson and William Laws, start having the problems, as we talked about. He started claiming Joseph Smith was trying to have him assassinated in January. The Fosters, they had dealings with, some of the Fosters were excommunicated years before. It's just these three families just are going head to head with Joseph Smith. A lot of it about doctrinal issues. The Laws truly believed that Joseph Smith, because of polygamy, was a fallen prophet. After they set up this expositor, they actually before that, they start up a new church.
But it's Mormon.
Mormon church, they just believe Joseph is fallen. They still believe in the Book of Mormon, those kind of things. They get some people with them, and they, print this newspaper. And I think quite honestly, the Nauvoo Expositor is a little bit misunderstood today as well. I mean, I think people ought to really read it. It wasn't just this
Anti-Mormon, inflammatory paper?
I mean, it was to a point. It certainly was to them, to Joseph Smith. But really, its real purpose was to repeal the Nauvoo Charter. And one of the biggest complaints in there wasn't just polygamy. It was actually what's called the habeas corpus acts. And what those were, and that's another topic I could speak hours on.
But you think that that one of the fortes of the Nauvoo Expositor was habeas corpus?
Yes. Yes, they speak a lot on that. They speak a lot on polygamy, Joseph Smith's character, habeas corpus / the Nauvoo Charter. So certainly there's the polygamy element, there's the habeas corpus element. The habeas corpus element that's a legal writ. Basically, when you're arrested, you can file this motion or writ for habeas corpus, and then they have to take you to a judge to make sure the arrest warrant was legal. And so Joseph Smith was arrested on 3 occasions. All 3 occasions he got writs of habeas corpus and was released. He was arrested by people from Missouri trying to take him back. So all of that is contained in here, and you actually track that in the city minutes, that they pass one, he gets arrested, they get him back, they think, okay, how are we going to monkey with, how are we going to make this better? He gets arrested again, they come back, and they actually had probably the most expansive habeas corpus acts in the history of our country. I mean, it got to the point where they would actually try the case in Nauvoo. So Joseph Smith, they tried the assassination of Joseph Smith. The Nauvoo City Council, or the municipal court rather, tried the case, said, he didn't do it, sorry, you can't arrest him. So people really inflamed and saw, he's lawless, there's nothing we can do to touch him. So that was one of the major themes of the Nauvoo Expositor as well. But that was their big point, was they wanted to get the Nauvoo Charter revoked, because it was the Nauvoo Charter that gave Nauvoo the right to have these acts of habeas corpus, whereas like Springville and Chicago didn't have that in their charters. So Nauvoo is a very powerful and different charter than many of the others. So that was released. They have a meeting on June 8th. The city council meets, and number one, another one of the individuals involved with the expositor was actually a city councilman, Sylvester Emmons. And so on June 8th, let me quote from this. The mayor referred to Councilor Sylvester Emmons and suggested the propriety of purging the city council first of nuisances. The man who steps forward to put down iniquity is the first to be put down by the people of this city. Mayor said if he had kept a whore from Canada here and since, and had done everything, he would have been as good a man as William and Wilson Law. So they start getting into these guys. They've attacked Joseph Smith personally. They've attacked a lot of these people, their moral character. So this meeting, it's kind of devolves into this free-for-all on the Wilsons, the Higbees, and the Fosters. And they just start, anything and everything that these guys did, they start bringing it up again. And, for example, Hiram Smith referred to Robert D. Foster and his brothers Charles A. Foster and Chauncey and Francis Higbee and asked, what good have they ever done? The mayor, he shares an experience that is obviously, the mayor, Joseph Smith, that had been bothering him for some time. He says, the mayor said that at the time he was under arrest, so one of those times they were trying to take him away, William Law pursued him for $40 he was owing Law, and it took the last expense money he had to pay it. So even though he's arrested, there's Law saying, give me that money you owe me. Councilor Hiram Smith, they connect these people with this individual that came into Nauvoo that Joseph Smith was originally very friendly with, Joseph H. Jackson. He was actually being followed by federal agents for some crimes he committed, and they actually got him a writ of habeas corpus, and he used that in Nauvoo, and they told the federal agents to hit the road. But later, Joseph H. Jackson started falling out of favor, and so they were trying to connect him with these guys. And they actually said, Councilor Hiram Smith continued and referred to Joseph H. Jackson coming to this place, and the mayor said William Law had offered Jackson $5 to kill him. Councilor Hiram Smith continued that Jackson told him he meant to have Hiram's daughter. Jackson laid a plan with 4 or 5 persons to kidnap his daughter and threatened to shoot any man that should come near after he got in her skiff. In the skiff, he was engaged in trying to make bogus, counterfeit money, which was his principal business. And so this goes on the 8th, and then Joseph Smith asks or says, calls for the destruction of the expositor. And so you would think that's it, then and there they go do it, but they actually don't. They adjourn the meeting, and 2 days pass, and then they meet again on the 10th. And while how do I put this? The meeting was a pretext. Clearly they were going to destroy the press. But as an attorney, what I found very interesting is they actually go through, they cover their bases in the sense that they go through the legal treatises of the day. They read the U.S. Constitution. They read the Illinois Constitution. They pull out the charter. They go through this, and they have an actual legal discussion. These, farmers or whatever from Illinois, and they come to the conclusion it's a nuisance. However, they do have to pass a new nuisance law at that point, which gives them a little more authority than what they were doing before. Because before, nuisances that they dealt with were animals, carcasses, and here in a grog shop here and there, a place that sold alcohol, but nothing like this.
So they had to pass a law that they were breaking, so they could
go. Yeah, they had to pass a law on the 10th, given the authority to go do what they did. And there was a dissenter in the council, Benjamin Warrington. He was a member of the city council who was an LDS, and he kind of said, whoa, guys, slow down. Let's fine them $3,000, a huge amount at that time. And the records indicate that Joseph and Hiram were very displeased that there was a dissenting vote. Ultimately, they call for a vote. it goes through, and the expositor is destroyed, as well as the Foster's barn. They tear down one of his barns as well.
He's the editor. They declared his old barn in the text a nuisance.
And so, I mean, that's just a small part. In the book, in the book,
Yeah,
it
maybe
goes
it
on.
was.
In the book, it goes on pages and pages and pages. And like I said, well, to me, it's amazing. To me, it's here are these guys that started a city from scratch 4 years before, and they are making legitimate legal arguments, looking at texts, laws, constitutions, and doing this. And now the question is, nowadays, I usually get asked, well, was it legal or wasn't it? I can tell you B.H. Roberts said it was illegal. They shouldn't have done it. Years ago, Dallin H. Oaks wrote a very good article on the suppression of the Nauvoo Expositor. He kind of came down on destroying the papers was fine, smashing the press wasn't. And I'm quite honestly still going through my head. I don't know. I'm probably more toward Dallin H. Oaks' view. But ultimately, I don't think it matters. Destroying the press doesn't give you license to go kill 2 people, which ultimately happened. But certainly another really good part in the book that I just gave you a little flavor for. It's much better than that.
Well, John, thank you so much for being here. Does anybody have a final question?
I'll just follow up with that. This is not quite related, but I know in the book that they talked a lot about the persecutions in Missouri, and there was a press destroyed in 1833 or whatever year it was when W.W. Phelps wrote that article on free people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Did the Missourians try to make anything legal when they destroyed the Mormon press, like you said here with what happened in Nauvoo, or was that extra legal as well?
I don't know a lot about Missouri. I knew that it happened all the time. In fact, I can't be specific, but I recall that actually the Nauvoo Expositor, that was the 3rd time it had been destroyed, if you will, the type scattered. It was an abolitionist paper. It was a press for an abolitionist paper before, so it had actually been destroyed before. That was the Nauvoo Expositor's first foray into making people angry. So it happened quite a bit. This one just ended worse. Yeah.
And one other question. Do you think that the Wilsons had any idea of what would happen after the destruction of the press with Joseph Smith, that it would lead to his death?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think they were sorry. I don't think they minded after it happened. You do get, and I apologize, I can't remember which one, but you do get one coming back into town after to retrieve property. And now, granted, this is the Latter-day Saints who are going through this sad, traumatic time, writing about it. That's the perspective I'm getting. But they are not happy. They kind of write that, and I'm sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but kind of acting entitled as he was coming back into Nauvoo, and the High Council and City Council had to tell the people, don't take vengeance out on this person. Just let him get his stuff. So, and also on that, actually, very interesting in here. You see all this anger before June of 1844. Then the city council takes a few months off, obviously dealing with the death of Joseph Smith, and then we get the city council again, and it's these very humble, meek meetings where they're talking about how much do we pay the laws for the damages we caused. Oh, I hope they'll settle, that kind of thing. And so they pressed for their money after the owners of the Nauvoo Expositor. So
Did they collect?
I think they did. I mean, I know that the Latter Saints had every intention of paying. I know they at one point rejected a settlement, which made the city council a little dejected. They were hoping to wrap it up, and so I imagine that they did.
Well, again, it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful bit of history, from Nauvoo, from early Mormon history. We welcome the public to come down. We'll have John sign a bunch before he leaves tonight. The Nauvoo City and High Council Minute Book, available here at Confetti Antiques. Welcome. We're glad you guys could make it. And thanks again for joining us here on Turning the Page.